But let me go to Ryszard. Uh, you've heard a lot about the ILO in this last hour, about the ILO taking up responsibility. I'm, if had it not been for COVID, I would be in another celebration of 100 years of ILO. You know, but COVID has put a damper to some of those celebrations. Uh, there's an echo, I think. Uh, but Ryszard, all that is said with regard to ILO as the institution that is responsible for standards, that is the safeguard for against wage theft. What is the ILO, or what can the ILO do in this regard? And my specific question to you is, because it's a recurring issue, I'm sure in the standards committee it has come up over and over again. How, and in the end, it's your constituency, it's governments, it's business, it's your constituency as the ILO. What can the ILO do in this regard? How can the ILO take this forward? What needs to change? We've heard about justice systems from Rola and Shashi and Shahidul Haq talk about change, a reform that needs to be done. So how does ILO, with its constituency, institute this change or bring about this change? Ryszard, over to you.
Okay, thank you, William. And these are searching questions, and I'm not sure I have sort of ready-made answers for them. But I'm really enjoying this discussion. I think it's really important. And first of all, I want to thank you and CCRM and GRFDT for organizing this and raising this issue of transitional justice in relation to wage theft for repatriated migrant workers. And of course, when we talk about wage theft, we're not just talking about non-payment or of wages, or increasingly, I think, as Dr. Taror pointed out in his remarks, migrant workers effectively being perhaps asked, but that would be a very soft term, required to accept reduced wages without really much opportunity to, to bargain this collectively with employers, which we know is a real challenge when it comes to the Middle East. And there are increasing evidence of non-payment of end-of-service benefits, which of course are significant when we talk about migrant workers who have been in the country for a long period of time. And this really is their social security, for lack of a better word, because there's very little social security in the Asia-Middle East corridor. And if they lose this amount, this is, of course, very, very significant. So thank you for bringing this issue up. And it is important, as ILO, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have tried to bring as much attention to the need for workers not to leave or be repatriated without getting, as you say, their dues. And it's actually been harder to advocate for this than may appear to be the case, because often the humanitarian situation of many of these migrant workers, particularly those in irregular status, is very much at the forefront. And, in listening to Dr. Traore, particularly when he was talking about the role of embassies, we see a very fragmented picture in this regard. So for example, in Lebanon, when the issue of repatriated migrant workers came up, the Philippines told us very clearly that they work or try to work as much as possible with the Ministry of Labor, as well as with employers, to ensure that migrant workers are paid their wages before they return. So that's obviously a very commendable approach. However, we don't necessarily see this with all the embassies, and this also plays out in the power relations between destination and origin countries that we heard of earlier. So whereas embassies can do a lot, they can't replace the operation of the rule of law. or taken an impartial approach to the settlement of disputes between workers and employers. And as you rightly said, William, in your question, and this has already been raised by the other speakers, and particularly when we look at the Asia-Arab states labor migration corridor, indeed the pandemic has magnified many of the recurring structural flaws, and as we often refer to as ILO, decent work deficits. And non-payment of wages was one of these structural flaws among many others, including the operation of the very restrictive kafala sponsorship system. So just to say that, and this system is also contributes, I think, to the issue of wage theft, because of course employers are afforded significant power over their workers, and to some extent, this is delegated from the authorities, from the government, and this goes directly also to the issue of non-payment of wages when the going gets tough, so to speak, as has been the case in the context of the pandemic. I mean, in relation to the role of the ILO, and you mentioned standards, but of course ILO has this constitutional mandate to promote social justice. So justice is very much at the heart of the ILO's mission. And this is reflected, of course, also in the setting of minimum labor standards at the international level. And the significant standard in this regard is a convention called the Protection of Wages Convention, which has actually been accepted by quite a lot of countries, 98 countries. And it says quite clearly that if a contract is terminated, then wages have to be settled. And, according to the laws, collective agreements, etc., that exist, but in the absence of those, within a reasonable period. And clearly, this is something which is not happening, particularly in the Middle East. I should also add, and of course, labor standards need to be accepted by by governments. That this convention, when it comes to the Middle East, has only been accepted by one country in the region, and that country is Lebanon. So none of the GCC countries have signed up to it. As Rula already mentioned in her remarks, yes, the majority of labor complaints we know concern non or late payment of wages. And one of the things that the ILO has been doing in the region is to strengthen the mechanisms that already exist. And the problems with these mechanisms are very well known. And Rula identified a number of these, so I won't go through them again. And there has been some progress in the region with regard to the improvement of these mechanisms. So it's not just about the courts, it's about being able to, for example, resolve your complaints in a less formal manner within the Ministry of Labour through dispute resolution. Courts have also been made accessible. Some of you may be aware of the system in Abu Dhabi, where complaints can be filed in a number of different languages, where there's accelerated justice, mobile courts have been set up, etc. We have a program in Qatar, as many of you are aware, and we're working there with the Ministry of Labour to improve the dispute resolution mechanism, facilitate complaints made by migrant workers. In Qatar, there's also a very interesting mechanism that was recently established, the Workers' Support and Insurance Fund, which is supposed to facilitate the payment of, what is due to workers before, so they can leave the country, and then the issues, the payments are recovered from employers. So there are, and we're also working in Kuwait to improve the access to justice mechanisms there. But certainly when it comes to these mechanisms were already there were already deficits, there were wanting, and they've been very much found wanting as a result of the pandemic. But clearly, in the first instance, the way forward is to indeed work on these mechanisms to include what's taken place, to improve what the mechanisms at the national level. And there is work ongoing, but it's slow. And in an extreme situation like this, as I've said, these mechanisms have certainly been found wanting. In terms of reforms that can be initiated, and I guess you also want to hear about what the role of the ILO can be. Well, as I've said before, the ILO is no stranger to this issue, and you already alluded to this, William, in your question. And we do have a supervisory system. And in the past, when workers have been expelled in large numbers, and here I'm referring specifically to expulsions of workers that occurred in Africa during the 1980s from countries like Libya and Mauritania, complaints were brought against these governments to ensure that workers would be paid unpaid wages. The advantage, of course, in these processes were some of the countries at issue had actually accepted the Wage Protection Convention, which is not the case, as I've already said, with regard to some of the countries in the Middle East. But obviously there are other standards that may be relevant as well in this context, like the Forced Labor Convention, if workers are required to continue working while not being paid. And that's a convention that has been more widely ratified by countries in the ILO system. Now, as far as ILO's possible engagement in a transitional, transnational justice mechanism, and there have been references in the chat box to, possible regional mechanisms that could be set up. Well, this will obviously require an international mandate and all the countries concerned to be on board. It's difficult to see this existing in a vacuum or something that is run just by civil society or by private actors, right? So a lot of advocacy would need to take place. Including in listening to Shahid's remarks, he already references some governments raising this issue before the ILO. And of course, ILO constituents, and particularly governments and workers' organizations, have an important role to play to raise these issues within ILO governance structures. Dr. Thoreau referred, and this will be one of my last points, to the UN compensation mechanism that was set up after the end of the first Gulf War, which really dealt with war reparations in both Iraq and Kuwait. And he said that this was not necessarily a good model. And I can see where he's coming from. Of course, there was more political will then. This commission had a clear international UN mandate, which flowed from the UN Security Council itself. There was already money in the bank, so to speak, because the fund was supported by Iraqi oil. But I think what the ILO did manage to do with regard to this compensation commission was to draw its attention to the need to settle the so-called small claims before the larger corporate claims were addressed. And these claims concerned migrant workers that were, required to depart in the emergency situation without having their wages settled. So the fact that attention was brought to the need to deal with the small claims, that even though they were small in in sort of more global terms, they were nonetheless very important to the individuals, to the families, and the communities affected by non-payment of wages. And I think that's a very important lesson going forward. There are a lot of people, of course, corporate interests, as we know, that have been heavily affected by the impact of this pandemic. But it really, I think one of the positive lessons, perhaps not a model, but a lesson from that compensation commission is the need to identify, these small claims and the individuals that have been affected. So I think that lesson can certainly be taken forward, if not the model of the commission itself. So I'll stop there, William. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Ryszard. And you have raised quite a number of points. And along the lines of what you have said about national systems, and you've highlighted some that are in progress or in the making, but you are also aware that they don't always work as efficiently as it is reported in the press. And I was wondering if the ILO, with all its technical kind of expertise, is it possible for the ILO in this current time, because it also might be, and this just might be, that governments don't know how to respond to this situation in a time like this. So could the ILO fast track, for example, a whole, which are the countries that have been doing this well, giving access to migrant workers, justice to migrant workers, make a kind of compilation of the countries that are doing it. What are the systems that they have in place? So that, I'm saying it from a selfish perspective, this would be a resource for this campaign, basically, so that we can then take this campaign forward to governments to say, look, if you don't know what to do, here are 10 countries that have done something, and maybe you can take a hybrid of it or just replicate any of this. Is this something that the ILO could think of? The other thing to I would like to ask is, again, for the ILO, it's this being an issue that is, I'm not sure where the ILO is now in terms of COVID and thinking of post-COVID and things like that. And we've heard about your report and the thing of job losses and things like that. I'm wondering if within the ILO itself, is there scope of looking at migration? And like Shahidul Haq just said a little while earlier, justice as an entitlement. Is it possible for the ILO to start a conversation of this, just simply because of the enormity of this issue and how it's impacting workers, how it's impacting workers on the ground, kind of thing? Is it possible within the ILO to start a conversation in a more formal way on this? So those two things.
Okay, thank you, William. Okay, with regard to the first point, and you're right, there is a big disconnect between what some governments say that they're succeeding on when it comes to access to justice and the systems in place, and the realities on the ground, right? And we see that a lot in the Middle East as well, that what we're sometimes told is a good model falls quite a bit short when we compare to what has taken place in other countries and other regions, as well as the resources and the capacities that go into building such systems up. And one of the things that we do when we work with governments in the region is to try and bring in this expertise to show them how a system, an access to justice system, where it's dispute resolution and how it interacts with the court system can work efficiently. And there is a lot of interest in this, not only from examples from outside the region, but also with regard to some of these examples that I've already mentioned, being put into place within the region. So minds are not closed to progress in this area. So that to some extent goes towards answering your question that yes, that the ILO can do more work when it comes to doing some more comparative work, research, comparing how different systems respond when it comes to migrant workers. But that's sort of more medium and long term, and I don't think it's something that can necessarily be done very quickly with regard to resolving, the acute problems that are arising in terms of wage theft, non-payment, late payment of wages as a result of the pandemic, and which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. In terms of having, if you like, a higher level conversation around this at the ILO, I mean, that's really very much up to our constituents. As officials which serve the ILO Secretariat, we obviously recognize this as an important issue that should be very much at the forefront when we discuss labor migration and the impact of the pandemic on migrant workers. And we hope that myself, Shabari, who's listening in, and others are doing our utmost in this regard. But there are also governance structures at the ILO. There's the International Labour Conference, which unfortunately did not take place this year for the first time since the Second World War. There's the governing body that will meet, hopefully, either virtually or physically in October. And this is where our worker representatives in particular, I say in particular, well, I was listening also to the fact that we also, of course, we also represent employers, and they should be taking up this issue as well. But this is the forum where hopefully, our constituents themselves can come together in a concerted way to raise this within the ILO's internal agenda, so it is adequately addressed. Obviously, there are other international fora which have already been referred to. The Global Compacts, the regional review of the Global Compacts will be taking place across the regions this year. The GFMD, not least because of course, it is chaired by the UAE, which is one of the countries very much at the center of the issue when it comes to the Middle East. And other regional dialogues. And I know you, William, and others are doing their bit in this regard. But also at the UN, the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, etc. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Ryszard, for those two. The sooner you can give us that compilation of countries where it works, the faster this campaign will pick up. So I will tell you that. For the other question, for those who are from countries of origin on this call, and for the people in the labor movement and trade union on this call, I like what Ryszard said. If we can push for this, this can work. This can be picked up by the ILO. So it's a lot of work that we need to do with countries of origin to say this has to happen. So let's take up that invitation from Ryszard to put this forward. And